collaboration with Mondo. They really helped me see out my dream in terms of the track surface, if you haven't seen, the weight room surface, the platforms. It was all kind of about designing a space that allowed us to train without compromise. This has been my passion, the combination of coaching and sports science. Got to give a lot of thanks to Coach Reeve. He was kind of one of the ones who really spearheaded my career and fast-tracked me. You'll see even 20 years after my time as a GA for Coach Reeve and as an athlete under him, that much of my training philosophy, much of my programming looks a heck of a lot like Coach Reeve's templates. A lot of the density kind of things and his basic philosophy and exercise selection, you'll see a lot of that within my program. I've obviously had a little bit of an evolution in here and there, but it's an evolution, not a revolution, and the foundation of which comes from the strong basis that I had with my time with Coach Reeve. If you guys have any questions in terms of the facility itself, feel free to ask me. We are fully operational today, so it is going to be a great place up here, nice and quiet, pulled away. When we go downstairs, it's going to be busy, so I'll speak with the guys that are down there, just make sure you guys have everything you need set up. There's a bathroom right here, a little kitchenette that'll be all our own. The only thing that I'd probably suggest is that they're right underneath us here. There's a orthopedic clinic. That is a partner of ours, but is a separate business to us. So if you're out there, feel free to take pictures. Our members are all used to getting pictures taken and stuff like that, or walk around. Just be careful and respectful of people's space, but try not to take pictures of that orthopedic clinic just because of, one, it's a separate business, and also HIPAA type of things. There may be some stuff going on in there. So facing that direction or not shooting directly at the clinic is fair game. There are locker rooms downstairs if you did need it. If you could find space and wanted to get a little workout in during the lunch break, all we'd ask is just like fill out a little waiver, and then you're fair game for that if you can find space. Anything else, guys?
Yeah, one other thing. I want to introduce Danny Bruno. Danny he oversees the strength and conditioning with Mondo. He's actually the one that worked with Mike, putting all this stuff in, and he does a great job. You all got to meet him when you registered and stuff, and he'll be around all day today, and anything we can do for you, we're here. All right?
All right, cool.
He's got to run in and out though, register people. We're going to have this videotaped for you, so it'll go on our website and then hopefully get to YouTube, so you'll be able to get all this stuff if we're doing it right.
All right, welcome guys again. Great to see some familiar faces. If I haven't met you, please introduce yourself. It's always great to connect and reconnect. So I have a lot of content here. I'm going to try to move relatively quick. It's going to be some core foundational type stuff, some of which will hopefully support and kind of build up what you're already doing, and maybe introduce some new ideas, some new thoughts that you haven't addressed before. So I'm going to start off with a very controversial statement here, and that's, does strength training even matter? As Coach Reeve already indicated, I came from a track and field background, and if you are not familiar, or if you haven't kind of been part of the social media, YouTube, Instagram ecosphere, you may have missed out on the fact that there is almost a backlash on traditional weight room strength, right? And regardless of what domain you're working in, it could be track and field, it could be soccer for sure, it could be even American football, there are practitioners, there are coaches that are kind of moving away from like traditional strength. You know, they say it doesn't transfer, it doesn't carry over. And I want to give an example here from my domain. This is Usain Bolt, the fastest man who ever lived by quite some margin, and this is him in the weight room here. Now I'm showing you this not because I think this is impressive, but because I think it's incredibly unimpressive. This is the fastest man in the world, doing some things which are a little bit dubious in terms of the exercise selection. The loading is something that you'll see our 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds do more of when we hit downstairs. And to make matters worse, here's his clean, quote unquote, exercise execution and loading. So this is a 220-pound man doing maybe a hip clean with about 130 pounds, 10 reps per set or so. So the reason I point this out is great that the guy's working out, he's lifting weights, but this isn't what we would say is like, hey, this is the fastest guy in the world because of this, right? Because the exercise selection, not too great. Exercise execution, pretty horrendous. The loading schemes, in terms of how much the guy is using, given his talent level, not all that impressive. So these are the kind of cases where people look at it and go, well, this doesn't matter. We don't need to be strong to be really fast. Look at all the powerlifters who are way stronger than him, and they can't run as fast as him. And you can probably think of the same type of scenarios of like, oh, Messi's not too strong in the weight room, or XYZ guy on the football field is not the strongest guy, but he's the best guy, right? Every internet warrior throws out these kind of case studies and says, oh, this is the case, we don't need to really be all that strong. So at the very least, I want to say it's clear that strength does not equal speed or athleticism. Let's get that out of the way right away. And I'm going to base a lot of this talk on speed. I know we've got some really great hockey coaches in here, and it's a little bit different for hockey, but most of the sports that we deal with are speed/sprint based sports, at least in some capacity, right? You've got to run fast, you got to jump high, that kind of thing. So speed is a good proxy for athleticism. And let's start to delve into why we might see this disconnect, because if we can understand why there might be cases like a Usain Bolt or someone else, we can start to make sense of why there's a disconnect, and then start to connect some dots in terms of what we can perhaps do to take away any of those arguments about strength mattering or not mattering. So when it comes to speed, not all speed is the same. We do see that when it comes to acceleration, there's pretty strong link with traditional weight room strength. And that's partly because of the characteristics associated with acceleration. Acceleration, we see longer ground contact times, ground reaction forces that are a little bit lower during things like really heavy jumping or top speed. We see concentric contribution, something I'm going to talk about quite a bit as we move forward, is very high during acceleration, like your first couple steps, regardless of your sport. Imagine being a football lineman in particular, or a bobsled pusher, or even coming out of the blocks on your first couple steps. Concentric strength, really important. You all would recognize that. But the eccentric contribution is much lower. Eccentric would be the faster, ballistic muscle lengthening that occurs. In contrast, in top speed, or really ballistic type tasks like repeated jumps, think of your skill players in football, that kind of thing, we see the concentric contribution goes way down, way down. And the traditional weight room is pretty much an assessment of, training of, your concentric strength. And the eccentric contribution goes way up. Traditional weight room is almost exclusively focused on concentric strength. In fact, it gets a little bit worse, quote unquote, than that, and I'll talk about that as we move forward. So really, acceleration type of tasks, and you can think of acceleration not just as starting out of the blocks, but am I moving from a slower speed to a faster speed? An acceleration occurs on your first couple steps, it occurs every time you change direction, it occurs when I jump. That's an acceleration. Max velocity, while I'm talking about it here in terms of sprinting, it is your more ballistic tasks, your more repeated jumps, your shorter ground contact times. This is, can we produce force really fast and with an eccentric component. Now for every guy out there like a Usain Bolt, there are peers like this guy right here. This is Asafa Powell. In fact, there's probably 5-to-1 guys like Asafa Powell. He's run under 10 seconds more times than Usain Bolt, more times than any man in history. And he did very traditional weight room strength work, very traditional. So those internet warriors a lot of times like to pick out the exceptions, the case studies, but really I think it's always best to kind of take a step back and say, what's the what's the bulk of people doing? What is the body of athletes in a given sport that are having success doing? And I think we've got plenty of guys, if you're any familiarity with track and field, you've got plenty of guys like Asafa Powell, like Ben Johnson, like Dwayne Chambers, who are very successful, very traditionally strong in the weight room, not doing a lot of poor execution, bad loading, bad exercise selection like we saw with the Usain Bolt. So I want to move on now and talk about specificity. This is a concept that we all probably have some basic idea of, and we oftentimes associate specificity with what the exercise looks like, but it really goes much deeper than that. And I think part of the reason why we do see these rare cases of the weight room not transferring to success on the field, court, or pitch is because of specificity, some of which I've alluded to already. Let's take a look at what is specific, and we can really break it down into many different categories, not just what it looks like. What it looks like, in my opinion, is probably one of the worst forms of specificity, because if you say just modeled an exercise after what it looked like in the sport, you'd get some really crazy looking movements in the gym, right? Imagine, for example, we said, oh, I want a resistance train like I sprint. Well, we could suspend you from a harness up in the air, and then you just spin your legs really fast. That'd be really dumb, right? But it would look like sprinting, but there's of course no force into the ground. You'd only be using your hip flexors to pull up. Right? If we did the same thing in swimming, I could look like I could hold 2-pound dumbbells and do this. It looks like I'm swimming, but it has nothing to do with swimming. So what it looks like is probably one of the worst forms of specificity. Here are a couple suggestions here, in no particular order, but movement velocity. How fast is it? Well, in most of sport, we're looking at movement velocities of like 200 to 400 degrees per second at the joints. In the weight room, you're looking at something like 50-ish. So we're way far off, at least with traditional weight room loading. What's the muscle group? That one we tend to get right. Are we glute dominant? Are we hamstring? Are we hip flexor dominant, etc.? Are we knee dominant? Range of motion. My default, as I'll talk about moving forward, is always going to be full range of motion. But I do think that there's a time and a place for sprinkling in some partial range of motion work. Most sport occurs in partial ranges of motion. I'll talk about the plus and minus of why we might want to include that and when we would want to include that. What's the muscle action? Is it flexion? Is it extension? Is it isometric? A lot of times we miss the boat on that one. Contraction type. Is it eccentric, isometric, or concentric? This one I'll delve into quite a bit. In the traditional weight room loading, we barely ever touch the surface of eccentric loading. And that's really where a lot of sport performance occurs. Sport is fast, sport is elastic, even the slowest movements in sport, fast and elastic, and the weight room tends to be slow and concentric. So we'll talk about how we might bridge that as we move forward. What is the relative load? One of the things that I see go wrong in terms of in terms of the weight room, especially in the past 10, 15 years, people don't go heavy anymore. Relative load doesn't necessarily mean going heavy though, it could mean intent. So I like to use a lot of heavier loads. I'm still pretty traditional in terms of my strength development, but the load should be more focused in on what is the force output. So you could use lighter loads on the bar. If that thing is moving fast because you're driving with a full intent, then the force that we're imposing on the ground or another object, another implement, is really high. If the load is relatively low, like you're just using mini bands, or you're using the crossover symmetry, or you're doing bird dogs till you get sick of it, there's nothing there. You're not going to reach stimulus threshold. And then where are we on the force velocity curve, or the load velocity curve, as I'll show upcoming. Elite sprinting is pretty interesting. And again, I'm using elite sprinting here not because this is focused on that, but because it's probably one of the most insane activities that you'll see in the sporting world. What we see is that these guys are applying about 5 times body weight load on every single step. 5 times body weight load. No one in here is squatting probably 3 or 4 times body weight load on 2 feet. These guys, albeit in a partial range of motion, 5 times body weight load on a single leg, and doing so in 80 milliseconds. Now what's really fascinating here is that that 80 milliseconds is about 50% shorter, 50% shorter than it takes to reach concentric peak force output. So how are they doing that? More force in a shorter period of time than we could ever do in the weight room on a single leg. Okay, so some crazy stuff here, and we're getting very aggressive hip and extensor strength, hip and knee extensor strength. So where do the traditional methodologies fall short? Let's be quite frank here. We'll start with some benefits first. We'll be fair and balanced. I assume if you're in this room, you're an advocate of traditional weight room methodology. It serves as the core of my training philosophy. You're going to go downstairs. I'm not going to be coaching there, but you're going to see my philosophy throughout the space as we're down there. You're going to see a ton of squatting. You're going to see a ton of pull-ups. You're going to see a lot of Olympic lifts, including our weightlifting team down there. So where does traditional strength training get the win? Simple and easy. Slap more load on the bar, you know you're getting stronger. No special equipment necessary. A barbell, a dumbbell, it is, serve the test of time, right? A lot of people go, oh, that's old school. Let's use this machine, or let's use this band, or let's use this special thing. You know what old school is? Old school means that it's like an alligator. Alligators haven't changed for millions of years because they were perfect in design, and they didn't need to change. So the barbell is probably the best way of loading because it's taken out any of the balance or any of the other elements that might compromise our ability to develop strength. So everybody's got a barbell, even if it's the old rusty one. Everybody's got some plates. Doesn't require special equipment. It's familiar. People understand it. I throw more load on the bar, I've gotten stronger. And when we're at higher loads, the load is a great correlate for intensity, right? If I do a 95% back squat, I know I've got to give at least 95%. At lower loads, say 50%, 60%, the load itself is not a guarantor. It's not a guarantee that the person is giving 100%. I might want them to give 100%, but the load doesn't guarantee it like at the heavier loads. Everybody follow that? So it's excellent for developing maximal concentric strength because of that. What are some of the drawbacks? One of the drawbacks is kind of the flip, the reverse of that positive, is that load on the bar is being used as a correlate for force output. And at sub-maximal loads, let's say in that light range, 30 to 70%, oftentimes the range where peak power output is actually going to occur, that the load itself doesn't guarantee that the person is creating the force output, the power output that we want them to. Someone could just go through the motions. That's another way of thinking of it. At 95%, you're not going through the motions. At 30% of the bar, weight room full of 30 athletes, you could pretty much be sure, without a lot of coaching, a third of them are just going through the motions. And another third think they're giving it all, but they're really not. It is constrained by concentric emphasis. In fact, constrained by concentric emphasis in the weakest range of motion. So what I mean by that is, if we think about our classic lifts, squat, a bench press, and we ask, how strong are you? What does how strong are you really represent? It represents how much you can overcome concentrically, which is your weakest contraction type, in your weakest range of motion. Right? So you ask someone what their squat max is, it probably represents something you can move right here. It sure as hell doesn't represent what you can move right here. So if I say, hey, my squat max is 200 kilos, 440 pounds, it really represents that bottom position or somewhere close to it. But if you loaded me up, not saying you should do this, with 600 pounds, I could probably move it up at the top. So I'm probably not achieving stimulus threshold in those more extended positions, and I'm probably not achieving stimulus threshold for eccentric capacity, which is about 15 to as much as 100% stronger as we are concentric. So this is a little bit of a mind-blowing concept here, but we're way stronger eccentrically than concentrically. Let's say, for example, if we take that 200 kilo squat, 440 pound squat, if that's where I am down at the bottom, concentrically, how much force I can produce, use some fancy equipment, some of which we have here, we can determine that yielding in this upper range, eccentrically, you could probably produce double that, maybe triple that. Like yielding to a very heavy load. Like you wouldn't be able to overcome it and stand up with it, but when you're fighting for your life, yielding to that really heavy load in the higher range of motion with an eccentric contraction, way, way stronger, okay? And then intent is only driven at maximal loads. A couple other little drawbacks here. Explosive efforts, often mistakenly assumed to be eccentric overload. My favorite example of this one is the really dumb cases of people jumping onto really high boxes and tires in the gym, right? Like they set their boxes like this high and they jump onto it and they perform some acrobatics to get up on the top. Well, it is a sign of athleticism for sure. The risk reward's probably not great, but they didn't actually jump that high. They just repositioned their limbs so that they could get on the box. But also, when you land on a surface that is higher than you took off from, you're actually taking out a lot of the eccentric loading. There's a time and a place for that. I do it all the time, but just know that a lot of the things that we might do in the weight room are explosive, but not elastic and eccentric. So, and they're plyometrics. Not all plyometrics are jumps. All jumps, not all. If we think of jumps as an umbrella term, some are plyometric, meaning they have like this very fast element of stretch shortening cycle, but we could jump onto a box and have no plyometric element to it. So many of those types of jumping activities, again, fall under that domain of having some weaknesses. So traditional strength training, great for enhancing the ability to produce force concentrically when time is not constrained. This sounds a heck of a lot like powerlifting. Right? I competed in powerlifting a long time ago. No hate for the sport whatsoever. But when the people on the other side of the argument say, hey, if strength really mattered, why isn't XYZ powerlifter also the fastest man in the world? It's because of this. It's because traditional weight room, squat, bench, deadlift, is great for producing force concentrically when time doesn't matter, but sport oftentimes doesn't occur there. And part of that is because of this. Eccentrically is where a lot of sporting actions occur. The muscle is forced to lengthen under a load that it can't overcome. Muscle is forced to lengthen under a load that it can't overcome. Sometimes this occurs before we can even see it, right? If I touch down on the ground, guess what happens? I have a little bit of amortization, flexion at the ankle, knee, and hip. That is the joints being forced to flex a little bit, being forced to shock absorb a little bit. Now, how well you can do that really matters a lot. An athlete's ability or capacity to resist yielding is going to be a key determinant of their athleticism. Think about jumpers. Think about people who change direction well, people who sprint well. They're not stuck on the ground like a deflated beach ball. They look like a super bouncy ball a lot of times. Boom, right on and off the ground. They can produce force fast, they absorb, they release that elastic energy really quickly. So how do we develop the ability to yield, and yield with stiffness? Yielding is not bad. We just need to make sure that we're in that Goldilocks range, appropriate for our sport. In sport performance, athletes are often required to produce force eccentrically under huge time constraints. Again, that sprinting, why I put it up there, is because it's the shortest time constraint that is observed in sport. 80 milliseconds. That's so fast that you couldn't turn on and off your stopwatch if you wanted to in that short a period of time. So they're able to produce those incredibly massive loads, 5 times body weight load, single leg, 80 milliseconds, shorter than the concentric time constraints. So this poses a problem. And we're going to address that as we move forward here. And how do we enhance the transfer of training to sport? Now, I'm going to start with some very general concepts and then move on to some specific ones. And then I'm going to give you some recipes before talking about the ingredients, and then we'll go into the ingredients of the recipe. General concepts here. This applies regardless of the exercise selection. Number one here, I'd say, is intensity. If you want transfer of training to sport, got to have intensity. This is a non-starter. What does intensity mean? How close are you to your maximal effort? And in particular, how close are you to your maximal effort not constrained by fatigue? So our field is a little bit broad, and there are different definitions of intensity. Sometimes, if you come from an endurance community or like a really metabolically oriented community, intensity kind of refers to how close are you to vomiting, right? And that's a different definition. I'm not referring to that here. Like 400-meter runners, 800-meter runners, CrossFit athletes, a lot of endurance athletes maybe, or even some well-intentioned but uninformed kind of coaches might think intensity is just like how exhausted are you, how sore did you make them. That's not what I'm talking about here. So I'm not going to put that down, but I am going to say that is not what I'm talking about here. When I say intensity, I'm talking about how close are we to our maximal effort output that is unconstrained by fatigue. Okay? So if we want to optimize for speed and power development, we have to maximize intent. Maximize intent. You have to give full effort, is another way of putting it, and minimize fatigue. Maximize intent, minimize fatigue. Now, I have kind of taken a lot of what I've learned from Coach Reeve and put this into practice by doing this right here. If you're familiar with the either what you'd call density training, or I call it rep redistribution, I actually have 2 studies on this where you basically do your kind of classic loading, and instead of maxing out the number of reps you can do per set, you subset it. So you redistribute the reps over more sets, and you have little intermittent rests in between. Sometimes I take as short as 30 seconds. Sometimes it might be like 2 minutes or whatever. But by doing intermittent rest, breaking it up, having a buffer between momentary failure, being as far away from momentary failure as possible, you can maximize intent, minimize fatigue. So the one study that I had published on this subject, we had 3 protocols. Kind of cool. This is a great example of density training at work here, especially for speed power development. 3 protocols. We're squatting, we're using velocity measures and power output. So they all did the same load. I think it was 75% in this particular study, 80% in this particular study. One group did 3 sets of 10. One group did 5 sets of 6. One group did 10 sets of 3. All 30 reps, all 80%. They all took the exact same time period. So we worked the rest periods so that the start to finish of that workout for the 3 groups, exactly the same duration. We were tracking their power output, their velocity. We checked them for post-session RPE, or how fatigued they were afterwards. Guess what? All of the same number of reps, all the same loading. We saw a straight line correlation that the more we distributed the reps over greater number of sets, higher power output. The average power output for the 30 reps was way higher. Less fatigue over the course of the 30 reps. In fact, we didn't even see a fatigue effect over the 30 reps in the 10 sets of 3 group. Finished the workout in the same amount of time, something that you don't really see in a lot of your cluster training literature, where they really play around with a lot of the rest redistribution. And what was really interesting is that they weren't fatigued. So we had a higher power output, same amount of time, and less fatigue at the end. In terms of what we're trying to train for here, that's a win-win. If you're trying to train for hypertrophy or metabolic fitness, maybe do it a little bit different way, but it shows you That's a really nice way of constraining these variables.